So our next speaker is Justin Borevitz. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution and is a member of the Committee on Evolutionary Biology here at the University of Chicago. He's also on the faculty board of the University of Chicago Program on the Global Environment. His current research includes genetics of local adaptation in plants, genetic variation in environmental response, genomic approaches to natural variation, and restoring biodiversity and biomass in ecosystems. Borevitz has a PhD in biology and quantitative genetics from the University of California, San Diego, and a postdoc in genomics from the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla. Please join me in welcoming Justin Borevitz.
My pleasure to be here. You guys are a fantastic audience. I sat through half the day yesterday and this morning, and the questions are phenomenal. What a stellar group. So I'm looking forward to a lot of interaction, and I'd be happy to get interrupted at any time with your questions. And what I'd like to do today is sort of unplug a little bit from the fast-paced finance and slow down and sit outside the planet for a minute, spin around and see where we're at. I think one of the analogies that I've heard is climate change is this waterfall that we're heading toward, and we've got kind of the economics and terrorism and security chasing us down that river. So we're sort of coming to a time where it's hard to look ahead at the problems that are right in front, because we've got all these urgent things right behind us. So whether it's Iran or the housing market, we need to also keep attention at what's coming up in the next 5, 10, 15 years, really. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. And because this is a symposium on global economics, and the reason perhaps that I'm here today is that we organized in this room a couple weeks ago a packed audience of academics and students and policymakers from the city on a topic called ecosystem services, all right? And this is a new concept. I'd say it's got a history of less than 15 years or so. Natural capital, ecosystem services, ecological capital. And this is trying to value nature's currency and also look back at the way non-human economies are run, from microorganisms all the way to plants and animals on an ecosystem. And this is one of my study sites here out in Indiana Dunes, Mount Baldy. I hope you guys know this area, and I hope you guys get a chance to take your students out there. They have a lot of outreach programs going all through the summer, but also in the spring and on weekends. And the National Park Service did a BioBlitz. Anybody go to the BioBlitz this year? So National Geographic and the Park Service brought a full parking lot at West Beach of buses from inner city schools and from Indiana to get them out into nature and to run around, burn off some energy, listen to the birds, look at the grasses coming up here. And remember the place that really not only provides the food for our human economy. We always think about plants and animals and nature when we're eating them, but hold your breath for a minute and remember who gave you that breath. That oxygen is generated from the plants on this planet, right? And that's what really makes our planet so unique, is that it has oxygen. It also has liquid water, which is pretty important, and that's due to the greenhouse effect of many greenhouse gases, which you know about, of course, CO2, and water vapor is also greenhouse gas, and methane. But that keeps our climate at a habitable temperature. And that's all changing now at rates that we haven't seen in hundreds of thousands of years, meaning it was Homo erectus our last ancestor, that noticed this amount of climate change. So how do we bring that into our economic system and really try to recouple our economy, our global economy that really has influenced this whole planet? And I'll show you the first third of my slide deck here, which is way overloaded. as usual, but hopefully you'll be able to use whatever amount of slides you want in your classes slowly. Don't use too many slides, of course. That's our problem with academics. We always get locked into these slideshows. But there's more than enough resources here, and at the end, please ask me to show you a few websites that are ready to go for lesson plans and allow citizen science, really kids of all ages and naturalists, enthusiasts, to contribute to ongoing research. And it's a great way to spend the time and get out in the environment. So let's talk a little bit about natural capital. And I like this slide because it really talks about a type of, it's all the work that we all do every day. Everybody's involved. Here's education and awareness, science, technology, sustainability, use, value. Land use is really at the core, our economic system, how we use land, both the surface for agriculture and water, and also the subsurface for oil and coal. So it's the biological, the biosphere and the geosphere that are really driving our economy today, and the waste is going up into the atmosphere or out into the oceans. And so if we think about this integration from the community, educators, scientists, public policy, and then we have environment in the economy, forest issues, genetics. This is an area that I work in quite a bit, and I have a few slides about my particular research and why I think it contributes to this large picture. You know, we're all trying to do our part, and I really am impressed to see you guys out here keeping pace with the research and trying to bring that all the way into the schools. And that's really unique, that we can take research just off the presses and pipe it right into schools. So you're teaching things that, of course, we didn't even know, and I'm not like I'm senior faculty here, you know. So it's a nice opportunity to be able to cross this divide, and it's also necessary for sure. We really are doing the important work here. I like to think about our society as resting on three pillars. This is government, civil society, and business interacting, and it's the economic system, our human system, that sort of negotiates this path. It is a human system, so even though there's fantastic economists that come up with important theories, especially at this university, really the planet is driving the system, and it's the laws of physics, not the laws of economics that are. So we need to make sure that our economic system matches those of the natural world, and not borrow our natural capital from the environment to fuel our society, because we will run out, and I'll show you some examples of that. So often we talk about the environmental crisis, the atmosphere. Climate change really is a symptom, not now becoming a driver, but is a symptom of our land management and our energy around the planet. Clean water I'll talk about a little bit, and this is going to be that problem right behind oil that you'll start to hear more and more about, and I think we need to step up and try to get ahead as we can. A lot of solutions are out here. Climate change is feeding into the water cycle in many ways. The carbon cycle and the water cycle on this planet are integrally linked, and we need to think about how we manage both of those, and energy is one unit to look at that. Now, our land use, recently fuel is now competing with land use for biofuels, and that has turned out to be more of a negative than a positive, even though environmentalists were saying it's sure great to get biofuel, palm oil or soybean, biodiesel, corn ethanol. Those are turning out to be competing with food and water and causing as much pollution. I'll show you a few slides there. Really, soil can be thought of as a non-renewable resource. Soil fertility, which is the foundation of our city here, nature's metropolis of Chicago, is built as the port for the Midwest production, and still is a big drain. We're mining our soil fertility to produce corn for fuel and for food, and soybeans as well, mostly for animals. So it's relatively inefficient and non-renewable, and will come to an end. And then the sixth mass extinction, this biodiversity crisis that's driven by our anthropogenic effect, is also a symptom but part of the solution. So as we start thinking about all these cycles and how they're interconnected, the solutions are in common. And so I also think that our financial crisis is because we're hitting the wall on a lot of these other things here. And so, again, the solutions to the environment and the economy bring us back into a soft path or sustainable. And I'm going to start with some of the gloom and doom, and I know everybody's tired of that. And so I like to go as quickly into the solutions that are small scale, that we all can take part of, and better ways to spend our time than processing Walmart consumption type of lifestyle. And so the solutions are integrated, as are these convergence of crises. And so let me show a few things to try to highlight the urgency. This is where we're at in the oceans, which are really the place that carbon dioxide is being dissolved. And so you might have heard of saltwater carbon sequestration, clean coal. We want to take these smokestacks and dump it underground into saline aquifers. Well, that's pretty much what's happening. This is results from my colleague Tim Wooten that's been out here in Puget Sound looking at pH. And it changes through the year, but this is carbonic acid in the ocean. And overfishing and other types of toxic pollution are really at all-time levels, and we're running out of safe fisheries. For some reason, around Africa, the international waters are only 10 miles out rather than 100 miles, and so Europe and the U.S. and Japan, we're all heavily fishing the last of these fisheries. And that's really the protein source for most of humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. Here's a little patch, this plastic patch in the ocean that has more plastic than plankton. It's for some where all the currents seem to converge, and so it's a good place to look for recycled materials, let's put it that way. Here's water extraction. So I've got a couple slides on water to talk about where we're hitting severe water stress. Most of our agricultural methods rely on irrigation, and that's draining fossil water from below ground, the glacier melt that left these underground aquifers, as well as our Great Lake Michigan and the Great Lake system, where 20% of the fresh water is. That's all fossil water. We can certainly drain it faster than it recharges, and we're going to have to think about the recharge rate and where water is being deposited, because with global warming, the zone of where you get the snow melt is moving north and south. So the high mountains of the Andes, which really catch these equatorial storms, are vulnerable. Those equatorial glaciers are melting. We've got the Himalayan glaciers, the water towers of the world that feed billions, maybe half of the planet in this region, the 5 largest rivers. So water. Here's the difference between water stress and water scarcity. So where we're hitting the wall now, so that the maps don't quite overlap if you look at the non-sustainable use versus where we're actually out. So these maps are about to expand. Here's what we've done to the hydrological cycle. It's really one of the main indicators of the fact that we're in a new geological epoch. So if you know about the Pleistocene, was the peak of the last glacier times, and for the last 2,000 years, and all of our agriculture, 3,000, 4,000 years, depending where you are. The glaciers retreated here 12,000 years ago. We entered the Holocene, and really where we're at now, there's certain natural areas in the prairies, for example, these prairie remnants, which I call Holocene refugia. But now it's been accepted that we're in the Anthropocene, or new geological time. And that's because humans have disturbed the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, the land use cycle, the erosion cycle. We'll see the major impacts. And so the upshot of this now is that since we're modifying the surface, for our economic system. Another economic system could ride the water cycle, is one way of talking about it, or work with Mother Nature, or grow at the rate of sunlight is another way of thinking about it. And so we're the problem and the solution at the same time. We've met the enemy and he is us. Okay, so these are the last few slides on water, just to press that this should be an issue that you guys talk about. And water trading, water wars, virtual water is going to be one of the most important things to look at. And we should pull up a site, virtual water, or waterpressures.org, and you can look at the water footprint of all the food that you eat, of the cars that you drive. For biofuels, it takes a lot of water, and so our impact could be measured in a unit of gallons or liters, and so the natural resources have been modified largely for human consumption and for energy, and that's all right. It's not going to change. We're not going to disappear overnight, but our populations will stabilize, and it's going to be important to think about how we manage the water cycle. Here's one more slide that talks about the Aguala Aquifer. This has a surface area, let's see, we said two-thirds the volume of Lake Michigan, and it's actually larger in surface area, and we're draining this for the circle farms of agriculture, corn and soybeans that are subsidized with your tax dollars, but mostly subsidized with fossil water, and will hit water shock. And it's also starting to change the flow of the underground rivers that connect all these aquifers. We create depressions in certain areas, and we start to see sinkholes in the center of these circle farms where the pumps just fall down because there's a void where the water was holding up the soil below, and so it actually causes little earthquakes, just like when glaciers melt, we see little earthquakes. Here's erosion. So soil is coming down, flashing off quickly. The rivers systems often are not slowed by natural meandering rivers. And with deforestation and agriculture and plowing, the surface flushes quick, and it takes a lot of sediment with it. And sediment may be one of the worst pollutants in the world because it also obscures light coming in, so it changes the whole phytoplankton cycle. Fish can't mate. You get certain type of invasive fishes, and then the oxygen levels drop, all due to sediment, which is really soil fertility that's moving off and onto the continental shelf. Part of this is a natural process. There's always erosion going on, and actually erosion rock weathering is part of the geological carbon balance, and so new rocks become carbonized with carbonate, and that sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere, and on the hundreds of thousands of year cycles you can bring the atmosphere into balance with new rock weathering. So a certain positive side, if you will, of new erosion. But this is mostly fertility that's been built up from glaciers grinding away, or from deep historical processes, and that's a non-renewable resource. Okay, so here's a couple solutions, and we need to think about what are the economics. Not channelizing rivers or rebuilding rivers to flash water off, but to create natural systems, and there's lots of beneficiaries here. I think, of course, water is one of the drivers, but these meanders have large recreation areas, and so if we're thinking about urban restoration, and there's going to be a lot of people visiting here, then fish, water temperatures slow down in a stream that has a meander. You also reduce erosion, mostly because you've slowed the speed, but also because rivers like to meander. That's due to physics. They're going to want to turn. You also create fast and slow areas, these riffles, and so you can oxygenate naturally. In Chicago, I'm a big kayaker. You can go by these areas where we inject a lot of water just to get some oxygen in there to try to digest a lot of the sewage waste, really, which naturally breaks down. And so with oxygen back in the rivers, that's an important thing. So re-engineering some of our channeled systems is a good solution. Another one that we talked about in this ecosystem service meeting a few weeks ago can be called nutrient farming, and I think we're going to see a lot of this in the next couple decades. It's a hot area to get into. How can we think about our waste as energy or waste as food, or reclaiming resources? There's lots of ways to think about how do we not just flush this agricultural runoff, these drain tiles that are put underneath our farmland so that you can get in and farm it. Especially with this spring, we've had so much water that they've not been able to plant really and take advantage of the extended growing season that we're getting with the warming, because there's too much water. And so these drain tiles were put in to allow that to flush. That's the way we sort of plowed the prairies. But instead of flushing that right into the river and sending it all the way down to the Mississippi with its toxic nitrogen loads, which I'll show you, we can capture that in these nutrient ponds. And these can be little managed, reconstructed ecosystems that filter fertility coming off of the farm, slow down that erosion, and keep it on farm there. And so this is a way, and there's already economic models for that. It's called nutrient farming or water credit quality trading, and hopefully we'll see this year a cap on nitrogen and phosphate, that those are not regulated. Nonpoint Source, which is essentially farms and lawns, are allowed to pollute at will the excess fertilizers that run off, and so that can be captured in these constructed wetland systems. And here's an even more constructed system where it's a natural sewage treatment, where you take a community's wastewater and pre-process it a little bit, bubble it through. You need to slow it down and let nature digest and dissolve all these nutrients coming out. You could ferment it, you can make biogas and biofuel and grow algae in here and really create a whole natural economy that's going to replace the water. This waste, which has been a negative externality that we pay to get rid of, somebody's going to take that and turn it into usable products mimicking natural systems. And so unplugging from our large infrastructure and holding a little bit our waste and water into reprocess is a good solution. So, okay, now land use. Land use, this is the Anthropocene again. This is from the Nature Conservancy's Peter Kariva a couple years ago. In science, this is the part of the planet that we're stepping on heavily. We're crawling in here into the rainforest, but you can see most of the planet has been managed by humans, just so there's no illusions. This is rangeland, farmland, and urban built environment. We've also connected the planet with our shipping traffic, and there's other videos that I hope you've seen about planes flying around the world. So really, globalization is here and not going anywhere, and we have to figure out how to work within that system, and I think there are quite a few solutions. Here's the soil degradation maps globally. So we really are starting to, these very degraded areas, we can't continue on the way that we're going. At the same time, hungry people all over the world, and also obese people all over the world. You know, even in India and China, they're starting to have an obesity epidemic, and so the haves and the have-nots are getting wider. At the same time, we're consuming our natural resources in the name of growth, and so growth for the sake of growth, to just perpetually increase GDP without including this natural capital component, it's going to hit another shock. And I think that's not a shock that we're going to recover from. It's sort of like a Dust Bowl shock that's going to take many years and a lot of migration and pain coming. So if we think about the atmosphere, 383 parts per million, it takes a little step down here in the spring when the northern temperate forests put their leaves out, and every time you see a leaf, you can think about that as a breath of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That where is that biomass coming from? It's not coming up from the roots, it's coming right out of the air. And so the planet breathes on this little cycle of a couple parts per million carbon dioxide with the temperate forests in the northern hemisphere. And so what happens to that carbon? The leaves drop and it gets metabolized and goes back up into the atmosphere. That's the natural cycle. A lot of carbon is also pumped into the ground, especially in our grassland systems. And so this is the total carbon on the planet. A lot of it is up in these temperate continental regions underground. All right. We also, of course, know about the lungs of the planet, the big Amazon rainforest, Congo, in Indonesia, and we need to stop importing forest products or fuels or food from these regions, especially Argentinian beef. And you'll say, okay, that's not competing directly with rainforests, but indirectly for rainforests, because as soon as farming is increasing, then that pushes the rangelands out, and so the animals move into what was forested area, and the first thing is the roads that go in, and then they clear the big timber, and then they burn it, and then they graze it, and then the first floods will send the sediment downstream, and these tropical systems don't have the carbon below ground. So here's the carbon in the vegetation, right? That's here in the rainforests, and the carbon below ground is up in these temperate regions. So this is amazing locations for carbon sequestration, if you think about it. And that's kind of the area that my research is going in collaboration with the Argonne National Labs, is how can we try to incentivize restoring natural systems for both carbon and water sequestration. And so luckily, nature has a lot of solutions. It's going to be very difficult to keep up with our fossil extraction, right? So this biological land use system, whether it's forests or farming, that's always in a natural flux of carbon, and we've moved a lot of the biological carbon up in the atmosphere, and we've also dumped now even more geological carbon up into the atmosphere. And so both solutions now need to be driving that back down, and as soon as we can recouple our economic system to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, I think we'll be in a better system. And we need to make sure that we're not trading water for carbon. We need to put those two together, and that's essentially what plants do. All right, and so the global respiration between plants and animals, or between the dominant animal on the planet, ourselves, our respiration is exceeding the sequestration, and so that needs to come back into balance. And so it's managing these systems that are the solutions. Here's our prairies. The prairie state of Illinois has basically been extinguished. It's 99.9% of the prairie has been plowed, and so this 0.1% is where we can try to study these remnants. And when we go down, you can go down several meters and still find roots. You can still find this sod that settlers built homes out of. A lot of that has been plowed right up, literally, into the atmosphere. But within 10, 15, 20 years, you can get a good fraction of that back. And prairies will continue to pump carbon below ground for hundreds of years. So it's a long-term solution that's not going to get burned in deforestation. So it's actually interesting. I don't know if you guys had other people talking about this Copenhagen meeting where we're trying to institutionalize some global trade in carbon to try to reduce emissions. And so instead of really reducing our emissions, we can just pay the third world to stop burning their rainforests. And that's a lot easier. It's most economic. We should do the easiest solutions first. And to me, that's kind of like outsourcing our green jobs, right? And so instead of really cleaning up our own house, we're incentivizing others to not produce food or steaks or other things and produce carbon instead. And that's really not the right model, although certainly we need to preserve the rainforest. And so it's interesting to think about the security on this biological carbon, because if you're going to pay farmers or pay foresters to set land aside for natural systems, and we'll talk about a whole list of ecosystem services, what happens if a forest fire goes through? What happens if we put, I think the Waxman-Markley bill has $1.5 billion that's our own little contribution to, those are the offsets that can be exported. And, that will save some forests, and it should be done. I don't know if it's an equal trade for a ton of carbon in a big tree. A tree could be worth way more than a big chunk of coal, especially if you think about its ability to pump water and create habitat and all these other things. But at the same time, a couple hundred years, what might happen to that tree? It's going to die, and it's going to break down, and so unless it's equally replaced by another tree, you really have an offset that geological carbon with biological carbon. The prairies, on the other hand, when you put that root system down underground, it's much more stable. And it's also on the interface. So the soils are the interface between biology and geology. You're dissolving rocks. You're putting carbon atoms out in clays. The fire on top, so the black soils of the Midwest, actually prairies, you might think, well, burning, that's going to release carbon dioxide. But it actually promotes root growth, and prairie fire might only be 30% efficient, so a lot of that ash is carbonized, and it goes right back into the ground. And so the black soil is carbon. And as we continue to farm and plow that up, the soil gets lighter and lighter. The sediments go down. Microbes start digesting that carbon. And so it's not the sink the way it could be if we restore some of this natural systems.
Can you please just define the biological and geological?
The short definition, biological carbon is what's cycling in the biosphere, and geological carbon is what's cycling in the geosphere. In other words, it takes hundreds of thousands of years to move through the geosphere and hundreds of years to move through the biosphere. The longer answer is carbon is basically stored in a fossil form. The most stable way is coal or oil. The biology, the most stable form, is in this interface in soils. It's not perfectly stable, as we thought about all that carbon in the soil, especially in Russia, where the permafrost is melting. That's going to get, once it thaws, then it's available to be digested by microbes in the ground. And so there's a big transition here. And then the most rapid cycling is biofuels. So it's could be that year you get this much growth, and then you burn it at the end of the year, or you eat it and it gets metabolized. So there's this balance between respiration and sequestration, which is photosynthesis, right? So all of life's primary energy comes from the sun. Once those electrons are pulled off of water, the oxygen in the water, they are attached to carbon out of the atmosphere, right? So it's a two-step process: harvest light, split water, attach it to carbon, and that's the energy currency of nature, and it's driven by photosynthesis. And we really sped up the cycle, and we're going back to fossil photosynthesis, the fossil sunlight that's below ground. Here's another really tipping point. This is the elephant in the room. You heard about peak oil a little bit. There's really a sort of controversial topic. It depends what price. And natural gas is starting to really take over. Sometimes you hear that natural gas is a clean fuel. Methane, natural gas, is 24 times more potent than than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. When you burn it, that's why you see a lot of times these flares on top. It's better to have CO2 in the atmosphere than methane. So a lot of times they just flare it off, especially and these natural gas comes out as a byproduct of oil wells and refining down in Indiana. You can see them flaring that off. It's can be cleaner as long as none of it leaks, because it's more potent than CO2. If you have even 1 or 2% methane leak, then it's going to have the same effect as CO2. And so this balance is sort of debated. Do we have 40 years or 30 years? And if you say in this area there's these tar sands, and shale. We import most of our oil now from Canada. That was the way we were going to get off of foreign oil. You heard a little bit about that. Canada is really another state, isn't it? So that's a better kind of energy security relationship to go and mine this. Now, it takes 3 barrels of water to get 1 barrel of oil out of tar sands. Tar sands are basically coal. If you really want to spray it down with enough steam, and they use natural gas to spray this oil shale to create oil, you have to put in about 2 barrels, 1 to 2 barrels worth of oil energy to get 3 barrels out of tar sands. And so we might be able to, we're not going to hit peak coal for 150 years, but there's this thing here too. And this hasn't been out of the oceans since the dinosaurs were around, since there was palm trees in Antarctica and crocodiles at the North Pole. So we're talking about a couple 100 million years. That's another world that we have no idea. And methane hydrates are starting to bubble out as the permafrost. So there's some real concerns, all right? Let's just put it that way. CO2 emissions and global energy demand is projected to go up. How are we going to bring our consumption down but our quality of life up? And for a long time, the development model has been quantity and quality were correlated, that when you're barely surviving and you need more to eat, that you're going to have a better quality of life when you have it sufficient amount. So it was about increasing quantity was proportional to quality. And we hit a threshold, turns out to be about $10,000 family household income, sometimes even a little lower than that, global average, where you don't really get that much more quality of life for your quantity of life. So we have to figure out what it is that we really want. And I was so glad to hear the speaker before talking about how we're already starting to save a little more money. That just in the last quarter or two, our personal savings are starting to go up, and I think people are feeling more comfortable doing a little less, keeping a little more security in their pocket. And I like to say, if businesses are still trying to get back to business as usual, they're not going to, I mean, we're no longer in the times of business as usual. So we have to ask ourselves, are we still doing business as usual? Are you teaching the same way you did 3-4 years ago? I don't think so. You're already here. You're going to have new lesson plans. We're constantly updating things. So our business models need to really readjust the way we think things, and eventually we'll have policy change. It seems to be going about as good as it can compared to last year, but is it really keeping pace with where we're at? So our politics took a step in the right direction, is my opinion, but the environment's taken a couple steps in the wrong direction. So we're not looking to get back on business as usual. We're looking for a soft path. And really the paradigm shift in the last, my generation, is from the economic system that was developed in the small world, empty world, where growth was infinite. We had an inexhaustible supply of water, an inexhaustible supply of natural resources. Actually, England cut down all their forests. That was the base, the carbon energy for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And when they ran out, they found this other black stuff in the ground that was great for fueling steel production and whatnot. And so that was the beginning of the Industrial Age. And we're now coming out of the Industrial Age. And what is that next system that was going to allow us to live within the confines of the planet? The planet's not growing at 3% a year. GDP can go up if we want. It depends how we measure it. And there's a lot of intellectual capital and knowledge change and cultural activities that are wonderful for globalization. But production, can't continue to grow forever because there's finite resources. The ultimate energy coming in from the sun is really more than enough to power us. We have to figure out how we harvest that efficiently without any other negative effects. So this is the new economic system that we're in, and we can no longer expect to see, infinite growth. And that's what 3% per year, 2%, whatever. It's exponential, and it's going to continue to go. But we're hitting some real limits, as you saw. So we do live within the global ecosystem. We can't forget about that we're just one part of this whole natural system that creates the quality and the habitat of the life that we enjoy. And so this, back to the ecosystem services idea, this is a slide from our USDA, which for them to start talking about is a really big step forward. Traditionally, all of the energy was focused on production, yield, as defined in the amount of grains that can come out of an acre per year, right? And so forestry and fishery models talk about this sort of sustainable yield over 10 years or 15 years. And so there are some approaches, but most of our annual crops have been annual yield and plowed under. And that's really a primary ecosystem, that's regrowing from the beginning every year. You're never building on the progress. And natural systems have evolved over hundreds or thousands of years. And they do maybe not as intensive crop production, although lots of forest products and of pre-civilization subsisted on natural products. The carbon in the forest, the water holding erosion protection, and the ability to meander these streams so water percolates, climate control. If you just go into the shade, you'll realize what nature's providing. So we need to think about putting a price on these, especially in our very heavily managed built environments. There's a lot of controversy with some friends that don't want to put a price on nature, because if that price is not right today, you might just cash it out, right? And so there's on the environmental side, this is very controversial, whether you want to start valuing nature and trading credits, because you might undervalue it and cash it out and say, boy, I really wished we wouldn't have cleared that forest. On the other hand, not valuing it, it's priceless. So what is that price? It's often zero, right? And so that needs to get incorporated. And I think that we're going to emerge on not this natural system versus managed system, but all kind of intermediate systems. And if you know Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, he's talking about perennial agriculture, and they're making some progress there. One of my graduate students is working with them on perennial wheat. So you don't have to replant it every year. It's low input. It's slightly lower output in year one, in year two, but then you've got this big root base, which gives energy to the spring seedlings coming up, and they get a jump on the annuals, which have to develop from a little seed. And so after 3, 4, 5 years, the yield becomes equivalent. Of course, you're also taking advantage of this longer growing season. So there's many new approaches to try to integrate natural systems agriculture, is what it's called. And I think we're going to start to see economic incentives that put us in that way. So here's a short list that I wanted to add. In city areas where there's a lot of contact or potential for contact with people, the recreation value of natural systems is huge. What would happen to our home value if we didn't have these great parks all along here in Chicago? What's the value of that bike path or Burnham's vision? We've got the boulevard system and the forest preserves, and they're invaluable, but we could actually put a value on how many people go and what does that do to the surrounding real estate market. And there's lots of ways that we talked about at this meeting, and the talks are all available. You can look them up. The recreation value is going to be really high, but in rural areas, you might think the wildlife habitat, the duck factory that used to be all throughout the Midwest, and so we started draining these little ponds, restoring ecosystem services, or just managing our agricultural land to have a little more habitat potential is going to be really important for endangered species, or maybe you're going to create these wild animal parks and things like that. Now, the kind of fixed Services is the climate control, which we're in desperate need of. You know, the urban heat island effect can be mitigated by rooftop gardens and urban forests and trees, and there really is no excuse to not put a tree in anywhere you can because of this air conditioning potential. You know, it's really the natural swamp cooler that's driven by energy from the sun. It just, plus the habitat and the recreation. I mean, that's happening. You know, Daly loves trees. They love counting their greenness of a city by how many trees they put in, but they don't count how many trees live or how big those trees are. And so there's Open Lands as a group that teaches tree keepers, and that's a great thing to get your students involved in, is taking care of the trees that are there, because right now they die after 3 to 7 years, and you have to replant them, and so you have always these little spindly trees that never really get established, and the urban environment is pretty tough. So flood control, you know, we talked about redoing our water systems, and look at all the basements that flood. Why don't we just let our parks flood once in a while? You can replant those. It's much less damage, and we need to be prepared, as you know, for more intense storms, as well as longer periods between those storms or droughts. And so these kind of ecosystem services can really be have a whole suite or a portfolio of values. And this is the definition of green jobs, and I think this is the sector that's going to be growing. There's no question about that. This is rebuilding our natural capital, not only trying to use less and conserve, but really get out in front and start planting for the future, because carbon sequesters at an exponential rate. You can just look at how trees grow. It takes a few years to get established, and once they've got really nice solar panels out there dangling in the wind, they're going to be greening up quicker and growing faster. Carbon sequestration, this might be the dominant one, but we need to make sure it doesn't take, just one big thicket of buckthorn is not the best ecosystem, even though it might have a lot of carbon. It's not going to have any of these other things. And it's also more vulnerable to collapse. So you've got to have, it's not just tons per acre per year, but what is that security over not even 100 years? It needs to be thought of on a longer time period, and we just don't have the systems to do that. And here's one that you might not think about unless you remember the honeybees. Why are honeybees so crucial for society? And they pollinate more than half of our crops, almonds, all of them. It's about $10 billion a year in pollination services, and farmers pay about $150 for a little beehive per acre, and you wouldn't get any production of watermelons or things. But bees actually aren't the greatest pollinators. They're the ones that we quantify economically, and the reason we have to bring bees into all these fields is because we have no margins of natural areas where insects can grow, and so pollination services is a huge one, and I think that's a great thing for kids to get excited about and thinking, oh, what's these bugs? Bugs are bad. No, bugs are actually pollinating the flowers that give us the food. What kind of bugs are they? Where do they live? If you put a buffer strip or a little prairie garden in your class, we did that with my class. You can check it out. It's on 58th and Woodlawn. We got another one over by the Smart Museum. Every year I try to put a new garden, and it takes about a year or two, and we have the rush of insects right about the time that class is getting out. So, you know, the spring doesn't always coincide exactly with our teaching schedules, but it's pretty amazing to look at the pollinators. Okay, here's another slide that I like because it really shows the overlap between the economic and social values and the natural system. So our footprint on the planet, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about how you measure that footprint, is growing in here, and if we want to have sustainability in the long run, we need to also grow our natural systems and our natural economies and overlay it with the social system. And so we've got maybe less impacted ecosystems where we're looking at biodiversity, maintenance, and genes and production. And we do have the abilities now to identify new subspecies and populations that are going to be important for maintenance and for adaptation to environmental change. We can think about these services and products as they're overlapping now with our human values. And Then there's, of course, part of the human economy that's not dependent on nature. I don't like that. I love being all in this nature side myself, obviously you can tell. But it's a nice way of looking at the economic system. And we've largely neglected this overlap, which is growing every year, quite as you saw. So one area where we do have... So 600 million acres is the Midwest region. It's mostly planted in it used to be corn, soybean, but now it's often corn, soybean, or corn, soybean, depending on the ethanol subsidy and the price of oil. And the nitrogen is dependent on the price of oil, which is needed for corn, and the soybeans kind of produce their own nitrogen. If you guys know about that symbiosis with rhizobacterium, that's why it's a great alternative cover crop. In areas that have been over-farmed or set aside, we do have this Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. There was recently some modifications to it, both strengthening and weakening at the same time, our CRP land. And so often this is just grass, you know. So that's a pretty weak ecosystem, but it's still not going to erode. So when you turn these discs around and around, you compact the sides and they flood the fastest. And so you can set this land aside for erosion control, and that does a lot of filtering of the excess nutrients that would otherwise go right into the rivers and right down the system. And so we incentivize farmers to take land out of production, and now we might think about paying them for these services on that marginal ground, or even moving more of the land that isn't high production into more of a service model. And I think the right answer, it will always be evolving, but the right answer is paying not a flat sort of price for corn or even a price per carbon, but really rewarding good performance. All right, and so how do we measure that? It's the amount of leakage out of your system versus the sequestration in the system, and we've started this carbon inventory to go across the country and look at the richness of soils. And if you deplete your soils, you're going to not get the same subsidy as if you improve your soils. It might even be a property tax kind of penalty if you're really abusing it. So that'll always be a moving target, and should be a moving target, because every year we're going to have different climate, weather, food demands. But land use is a finite commodity. And really, we have to also live within the finite amount of water that gets filtered by natural systems. And so that's really the interplay. Here's a little cartoon that shows about all the activity below ground, and this is another way of measuring soil health, looking at the whole food web below ground. This is mostly forgotten, but these are the natural cultivators and processors, and 30% of the photosynthate is tied up in roots below ground, but 70% of it is excreted from the roots. So you've got the biomass of the plant is about 30% of the photosynthetic activity, and that can be turned under or charred. We talk about always harvesting the above ground and maybe sequestering the below ground biomass. But this other 70% of the photosynthate comes in through the leaves, goes down into the roots, and feeds this whole underground web, this microorganism. A lot of the organic acids that come out of the roots are for dissolving rock into nutrients, and they get bound up with that rock. And so that's a big part of the carbon cycle that's often just forgotten about. We think about these hydroponic style growing systems where if the plants need something, you just add it. And that was taken from chemical factories that had unlimited supply energy, which was cheap, and we didn't think about it. And so going toward natural systems agriculture is really remembering the whole ecological food web. The other thing that's indirect benefit of all these microorganisms in the ground is that they can control pathogen outbreaks. So there's all these natural predators and control systems, and yeah, they might take a little bite out of the yield, but they're going to also prevent against these outbreaks of disease and pests, because they're this natural control system in the ground. Okay, here's the corn that we're planting. So it's right here in the Midwest, especially Illinois, and Iowa is one big factory farm, really. Here's the nitrogen loading coming off of those farms right down into the Mississippi, which overwhelms the system. This nitrogen flush creates a dead zone, and one of my students corrected me that it's not the algal bloom, it's really algae is limited by nitrogen. They have plenty of sunlight and fresh water, so you get this huge algal bloom, and algae is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but then there's nothing to eat it. There's no little bait fish, there's no... The food web at the high level has been over-harvested, and we're flooding the web at the bottom level, and so they just go through a bloom, consume, then settle to the bottom and break down by the microbes. And so in that respiration of the algae, you consume the oxygen in the water, which then is difficult for the fish. So Chicago is 5% of this problem, our municipal waste coming in, and the rest is Nonpoint Source, coming down the Mississippi channelized rivers. And so what are the solutions? Now I'm done with that. The solutions, one of the great solutions that David Tillman from Minnesota has gotten a lot of traction with lately, and this is his prairie hay. Now, biofuel, it was this a couple years ago, the solution to everything. And so what is carbon negative biofuels? High diversity, low input. These little plots that he put out here in Cedar Creek, and the interesting thing is we have this replicated out at Fermilabs in Argonne, which is some of the best soil in the world. This is planted in some land that was really lousy, that was given to the university, just sort of sand. And so after 10 years, they had planted, this is some monocrops of different prairie species and switchgrass and some legumes. And then they had 2 species combinations and 4 species combinations. And this is a reconstructed prairie ecosystem with 16 species. And after 10 years, and they actually burned this, and so they looked at the nitrogen and inputs and carbon outputs, and they quantified the cycle. And every year, the roots are getting deeper and putting carbon below ground, and they would mow it and harvest and burn some of that biofuel off the top. I think about biofuel really as this icing on the cake, that you can't over-harvest biofuel or it's not sustainable. I mean, it just kind of makes common sense. You don't want to trade water or soil fertility for fuel today. That's not really getting us forward. But the prairie hay biofuel is a fantastic example of a little fuel off the top, sequestration below ground, and then you can add back in this flood control and groundwater recharge and soil improvement and habitat and recreation and every other service, and it becomes really attractive. And so especially in these marginal lands, prairie reconstruction is a nice solution. All kind of habitat restoration is a good solution. You want to match that for the future climate, right? And so a lot of times you think of restoration, let's fix it up to the way it was before pre-settlement and have these reserves where humans are the problem and you stay out, and we're going to keep our natural area clean and pristine. This approach is saying, let's rebuild natural areas that are robust functionally, not worry about matching exactly what used to be. Restoration is for the future, for performance, be resilient against future climate change, and maintain species diversity and genetic diversity of the different subtypes that adapt to these little areas that oftentimes our natural areas now are considered, like I said, Holocene refugia or remnants, and they're islands in an ocean of corn and soybeans. And so being able to move seeds around is really an advantage. And we might think about trying to do that strategically to get ahead of the climate change that's coming. This is interesting, the below ground. Here you've got 22 feet. Some of these composites, these sunflowers, compass plant, Silphium family, have just incredible tap roots that can drill down into hard pans. And so they're drawing on fertility way down, moving carbon down, and allowing water to seep down through these hard pan layers that we've created with agriculture. And also putting these into urban areas allows drainage So there's really a lot of function in nature that we can think about. And these are the results of the surface, that's terraforming. Nature has been modifying soils since life came out of the ocean. And so this is the result of the different types of soils. So these mollisoils that we have in the Midwest are really unique. These are the big grain regions of the world, and we don't have, this is where most of the human calories come from, and we really need to think about them as non-renewable resources that need to be conserved. Here's the soil layers, and so the size of these horizons, the organic layer is the things that are still decomposing on the surface. Eventually they get down into this black layer, and a little bit of fire on the top can slow down some of that decomposition. So fire is becoming now this tool that's an alternative to cultivation. Good soils. All right, so any questions so far? I can show you a few slides from my research, and then I wanted to finish with an estimate of ecological footprint, which is, to me, the best indicator of consumption. You might have heard of your carbon footprint, and then there's a water footprint. And everybody can measure their footprint and see how their lifestyle affects the amount of land that's required to support that. So, yeah.
You were talking about the 16 varieties and seeding that back to prairie. Are you talking about combining that with the CRP program, or how would that get adopted at a large enough level?
That's a good question. So what is the land available for prairie restoration? 60 million acres in the CRP this year. I think that could easily be converted, and there's discussion on that. Then to go out for another 60 million acres or so of the marginal kind of low-yielding agricultural land is also another possibility. Remember, that's the habitat that was from Colorado to Illinois, from Texas to Canada. That's the fields of grain that John Deere helped us turn over. I mean, they can also contribute to restoration as well. I think the economic incentives can make that happen. Another alternative is to not have this either-or kind of competition between agriculture and natural areas, is to really combine the two. And so in the margins of the circle farms is another idea, so in the odd sort of diagonal areas. And even trying to integrate prairie hay biofuel into ethanol distillation, because most of the energy in making ethanol is from burning natural gas to boil the beer. All right, and so why not cut some prairie hay for those boilers? And so then if the farm is producing corn for ethanol, and 30% of our corn goes to ethanol, the other 65-68% goes for agriculture, and we only eat 1 or 2 as raw. So to integrate corn ethanol with prairie hay biofuel is quite attractive as well, and that's kind of Jason Hill and David Tillman's lab's work. Any other questions? I have no idea how we're doing on time, but you guys can. 15 minutes? Okay, so my work here at the University of Chicago in the Department of Ecology and Evolution is interested in this kind of basic question. What is the mechanism of adaptation? It's especially important in today's world where we're losing species and we're losing local populations and genotypes. So the genetic diversity is going through a bottleneck, and at the same time we can think about what I call breeding for natural selection, which is creating additional genetic diversity by making wide crosses that might not happen in this island biogeography kind of situation where we have these natural areas that are isolated. And so the genetics we can read out with new sequencing technologies. The Human Genome Project ushered in this huge there's a whole department of mine that focuses on technologies. There's this systems biology institute now on campus. This is a major driver. You're going to have personalized medicine, $1,000 genomes by the end of the year. Here's your phenotype. Are you sick? The disease kind of NIH-driven research on understanding the genetics of disease. I'm really interested in healthy phenotypes and how your genotype translates into your phenotype. So that's kind of the big goal, and especially for plant biology, you can't think about growth without thinking about the environment, because you're a product of your DNA as well as the environment that you grow in, especially so for plants. And so it's this interplay between genotype, phenotype, and the environment, this cycle. And some plants will leave a lot of seeds, and when you have a generation change in certain environments, you'll have an enrichment of certain genotypes. And so this cycle goes around and around in both directions. And eventually, you have plants and animals affecting their own environment. As you go and create an ecosystem, the trees are creating shade where other plants can live underneath, and so you build up this sort of loop. Here's a couple examples. We talked about soil fertility being built below ground by these deep-rooted perennial grasses, which allows a lot more, creates habitat for a huge diversity of life above ground and for the future. Here's an example in the other direction where we've sort of created a big agricultural zone in Western Australia along this rabbit-proof fence, which is a beautiful, nice control. And in the off-season, there's a lot of heat being radiated off of these agricultural fields, which doesn't allow the moisture to precipitate, but as it moves over to the natural areas, which is kind of desert in the springtime. This hasn't greened up yet, but perennials are starting to green up. The clouds condense and create rain over that environment. So we're modifying the hydrological cycle, and here's a nice example of that. And fire is another one, where grasses create conditions that like to burn. They dry out, so they're drought specialists, but they also, in this tall grass region, they create conditions where fire will predominate. And if fire can spread through the grass, it's like giving it a haircut. Most of the biomass and the growing tips are below ground, and so trees and shrubs are pushed out by fire. And so this is how organisms can shape their environment. And of course, the environment decides what organisms are going to do well, and it goes through this cycle of adaptation where the genetics provides the organism with direction and modifies the environment. So that's the interplay. Here's a beautiful example of it. Aerial photo. This figure is made by Jeff Morris, a postdoc in my lab, and he's tagged switchgrass plants out in Indiana Dunes State Park. This is a blowout section where there's a tear in the fabric. So this foredune here, which was a couple thousand years ago under the lake, and now the lake's retreated and the ecosystem have marched right up along there. A blowout is after a big storm, or you get a tear, maybe a little deforestation or some erosion, and eventually the wind coming off the lake pushes through, and this is all sand. And so the habitat's modified in here. We've got switchgrass growing of different types and at different stages. And so we're looking at whether the genetics differ in this area or not, and how they might change through succession, through time. Ultimately, you get up into this forested area where the grasses no longer grow, and with enough water you can provide forest habitat. So we really have this whole succession going on here. And we're looking for differentiation and adaptation in this area. And here's that example I showed you before for prairies. It's another experiment that we're replicating here at the Fermilab Prairie Restoration Site. This is basically the result from Tillman's study, and we're trying to look at whether you can have multiple varieties and multiple species and do even better, because the best ones should survive, and then you can have local adaptation, not just to the Minnesota Cedar Creek site, but also here to, so one prairie is not the same as any prairie anywhere else, and so we're trying to look at that. Switchgrass for bioenergy, so it's the rock star species for cellulosic biofuel. I won't talk too much about that, but we have several cultivars that are selected in the south because they grow well and have a lot of biomass, and when you move them north, they don't flower at the appropriate time, which is actually better because then you get really a lot of leaf production. And so if you're not interested in seed production the way nature would be, because eventually if you're not making seeds at the right time, you're not going to be there very long. Perennials can get established. We can bring the seeds. So this is an example of how you might assisted migration and assisted adaptation to really rebuild these ecosystems for the future. and for ecosystem function. And we're seeing, whether fertilizer is going to be a net positive or not, because that was one of the reasons they chose switchgrass in the beginning. It does respond well to fertilizer. So this is our high biodiversity mix. And the results here, are coming in. We've got some prairie reconstruction as well as some, just a couple grasses to look at genetic diversity and species diversity. Here's the first year of the plots. You can certainly see that some of these are doing much better than others. So really the genetic variation is crucial and hasn't been looked at the detail I think that's required. The first results look like a positive trend for extra genetic diversity is giving us more biomass than we expected from the sum of the parts. And so this is getting toward that idea of breeding for natural selection, really throwing out seeds of all types, not just looking for that optimum type and planting it all across this 600 million acres. Let's think about the way it might happen in a natural context and know that that's sort of impractical on a large scale, but restore that at a small scale. All right, so if I have a few minutes left, I want to try to sum it up with this statistic that Matthias Wagernagel has been pioneering that's called the ecological footprint. And this is something that you guys can take home for your students. You can play the footprint game in class, and it's kind of behavior modification, if you will, and we can think about all these structural changes, policy changes, but there's a huge contribution that you can make with individual behavior from where you source your food, fuel, and fiber, and the amount of land that it takes to reprocess the waste. So that's what goes into the footprint. It's a unit of land, and we know land is this finite commodity. In fact, the amount of arable, fertile land is in decline, so it's not actually finite. We can look at the supply and the demand in terms of acres of arable land. How much space does it take to support your lifestyle, to produce the food, fiber, and fuel, and absorb the wastes for any one individual? And it's kind of like this statistic of the homestead. What size would you need? And now that we have really 8.6 billion people on the planet in the pipeline, if you just say everyone can have 2 kids, the sustainable population, if you look at our demographic trend, we're at 6.7 now. We're going to go to at least 8.6 if we can do everything to control population growth. So how do we share the space on the planet? A lot of it has to do with how much space we need. Okay, so it's really not this question of population versus consumption. It's population times consumption. So the planet could handle sometimes what's the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet as far as humans? Well, you have to say what kind of humans, and this footprint is that quantity. And it's about 2 million Americans or 2 billion Americans or 10 billion Indians in that kind of calculation, or Chinese. So the footprint, food, fiber, fuel, and waste. Are we getting too big for our house? And actually, I'll give you the punchline is that we're actually over-consuming right now. So we're living off the future. So we're at 1.5 Earths, and our consumption is beyond the capacity of the planet to recharge, right? And so sustainability at this point is not actually a reasonable goal. I mean, we have to get to sustainability, but we have to get past there because we're already overshot. And that's hard to talk about when there's all these other crises going on, but it's actually essential. And it's also inequity, this huge distribution inequities increasing. We both have obesity increasing in areas not only in the U.S., but now emerging in China and India, as well as more hungry people. And are we using our resources in a way that really gives us good quality of life? If we were all to live like I live, and I think about this a lot, I burn up the planet flying around trying to save it. I have a footprint of 5 Earths. And so I'll show you how to go through that. Here's a hectare. It's about a soccer field. So the unit is how much land is available, and how much land do we need to support our lifestyle. And that ratio gives you this kind of earth normalized unit. So if there's 14 acres available, hectares available for everyone, but we use 25, then you're overshoot. If everyone were to live like you, we would be in overshoot. So this is also a point that we can't forget, especially since we've been talking about ecosystem services and habitat for the last hour. We do need to leave some land aside for nature. And so can we use every available acre for humanity, or do we need to say, they're arguing for 10% for nature right now. Today, currently, we're at 78% of the planet is under the human footprint, and the rest is under the indirect footprint of the atmosphere or the oceans. And so can we lighten our footprint and allow there to be more for everyone? So here's the definition. In this economy, it's nature that closes these loops. And the big green cities movement, sustainable cities, is trying to close these loops right up in the system. So instead of throwing all our waste out into the rural areas and importing all our new resources from all around the globe, actually, we can try to close some of those loops inside. But this is the footprint statistic. So even though you might have a small house and live in the city and be relatively energy, have a low consumption compared to somebody that might have a big house. And in the suburbs, it's really the whole system that this statistic tries to measure. So what percentage of the planet is in the denominator? What is the biologically productive ocean? Only about 4%. The rest of the ocean is really a desert, and those desert regions of the ocean are increasing. The big equatorial regions, it's too warm to dissolve oxygen, so you don't get really a lot of production. Most of the long-range migratory tuna, shark, whales, they're swimming long thousands of kilometers looking for food, which doesn't exist through much of the equatorial regions, and with global warming that's going to increase. Most of the stable fisheries are up in these cold waters where you can have more gases dissolved in cold waters. Oxygen, and you get rich nutrient runoff, but not too rich from rivers up in Alaska and stuff. So we really only have 4% of the ocean. This is from 2000, so we might be down at 3%, and we really need to think about how global agreements to manage the oceans. The biologically productive land is at 18%. We have a lot of deserts, a lot of rock regions, a lot of ice caps, a lot of paved areas. What is the biologically productive land? I'd like to argue that we can try to boost that rather than continue to sort of mine the fertility. Here's the unavailable portion, and there's the rest of it sums up. So we really have only 22% to live on. And that comes down to about 1.9 global hectares per person if we divide it out by the 6.7 billion now. These numbers are all bouncing around a little bit as they're refining their statistical models and as they're as our consumption changes. But essentially, that's about the area that we have. It's not equally distributed, of course. So here's the demand side. So that was the supply side. Here's the demand side. We have the fuel. We have raw materials for industry and building and food production. And this is about the size. This is the fibers. And cotton, by the way, has an incredible footprint. Cotton is so ridiculously cheap. It's so hard on the land. It takes a lot of water and pesticides. Fiber is a big demand, and often we just throw these things away. So food, there's different types of food. There's more and more linkage between, Michael Pollan says, what is food in defense of food if it's been so manufactured and processed? Where is the industry and the food line drawn? And so generally it's less consumptive to be on this side. And building materials, it depends, how we source those and how we recycle them, and the fuel sides. And this fuel here in the forests, like we talked about biological and geological carbon, it's the best we can do right now to think about offsetting this carbon dioxide footprint in nature. I think there'll be some saline aquifers that are available for pumping CO2 in. And it's a big controversy in clean coal for, is there enough to put, there are some reserves in the U.S. There's very little porous rocks available in China. So sequestration is not going to be, coal sequestration is not going to be a solution for China, and they're passing us in their number of carbon in their coal plants. And so I think it's not going to be really a viable solution. So the way they calculate this now is that you need land to offset the CO2 emissions. So this is what it looks like. Here's the acres that are required. This is just summed across the planet for all people. Half of the land is for crops. All right, so our agriculture is the biggest demand on land. Grazing animals. So you can try to integrate this rangeland with forest services that can absorb CO2. Now is also at 1 hectare. So total demand is at 2.29, and the total supply is at 1.9. So this has actually gone up, and this has actually gone down since 2000 when they did this, and we're at about a ratio of 1.5 right now. So we're living beyond the capacity of the planet. And, you know, it sounds a little fictitious that how can you live beyond the capacity, but I think that looking at the carbon footprint alone or looking at water footprint alone, or, you know, this is one of the best statistics for us to sum up our whole resource consumption. I think we need to work on the supply side and the demand side. So we use a little bit for our built environment, a little bit for animals. The CO2 and the crops are a big one, and they really should be linked. You should be able to have positive agriculture. Right now, for the longest time, sustainable agriculture was not extracting materials from the ground. It was creating systems. So that's kind of where my work is going, is linking these two to create habitat and food for animals. And, you know, we might put some of our people back out in rural areas as well. And then fish harvest is a big demand on our fishing grounds. So that's almost the capacity is on par. So in other words, we're using the biological capacity of the oceans right now. The timber products and CO2 is where we're in big overshoot. The capacity, we're living in the built areas, that's obvious. And then there is more available rangeland, I suppose. That's what this shows. And the cropland is pretty much consumed. So now if we break it out by country, I think this shows the top heavy and the bottom heavy. If you look at Australia, Australia can take more people, all right? Australia's got 14 acres per capita. They use 7. So they're big consumers down in Australia, just like America. We also have a lot of land, but we are using more than our land. We import a lot of food, and we expect the third world to take our carbon credits. So we're overshoot. South Africa is an overshoot. Russia has got a little room to grow. Japan, no question. Even though a Japanese person is half of the quantity of an American person, you can probably tell that by looking at them. So Japan doesn't have the land to sustain themselves, of course, because their population is so high on that island. So this sort of shows the supply and the demand for land and lifestyle. And Germany is also about half the consumption, but they're in a very less resource-rich part of the world. China, with the big population, even though they really are 1/8 of the consumption, and you couldn't tell that by looking at them. But so China, most people in China need to increase their demand. They have a very low quality of life. And India is not on here, but you can get the list. Now they have it available on the websites for all the little countries broken down. And I've asked them for the data by zip code, because if enough people take this kind of quiz for your lifestyle, 2 minutes, we're about finished, then you can get sort of very local data here. And And this is a nice metric of sustainability. And you might want to go past sustainability, right? If you really are providing all your own resources, then you can export some of those to the rest of the world, or you can import some people to share your lifestyle. This is the trajectory over time. So we sort of hit this, could be the definition of the Anthropocene, when we exceeded the biocapacity of the planet, if you like. So we're all the way up now to about, this is Al Gore style, right, when you can go off the chart, up to 1.5 in 2007. So we really, sustainability would be right here, or if we give some to nature, should be right here, and we lost that, both due to consumption and to population. And so we need to kind of get over this hurdle. This is the last slide to show how you can think about consumption, and we hear a lot that China and the U.S. are the biggest polluters. Now, when you normalize that by capita, then we're still about 9 times more per capita, but they have such a big population. So you can think about this consumption times population in terms of land needed and land available. So we're part of an ecosystem. I'm going to fly through a few slides about solutions here. I think we need to clean up our cities, figure out how to live on smaller footprint, provide for ourselves, rural areas, and natural systems agriculture that I've talked about. Here's one of the green homes. She teaches at, Frances teaches at the Art Institute, and she's got 5 rooftop gardens, solar panels. This is geothermal wind turbines. She was in New York Times Magazine, and so she's trying to live a balanced lifestyle. She had trouble building that house because there weren't the trained people to know how to put this in, but that was about 3-4 years ago now, so it's not so scarce a resource as the knowledge. And so she's got a beautiful, sustainable home, nice quality of life. Urban farms is another way, bringing the food production right in, and maybe composting on site as well. Growing power and growing home here in Chicago and Milwaukee, and Ken Dunn's Resource Center and the City Farm are fantastic sustainable models of the city. Here's a very intensive built environment, and we could put these into skyscrapers. You can live on 200 square feet for one person in these growth chambers, could grow enough food. I just noticed Cameron walked in here. He's tried this experiment. In my lab, we have a little growth chamber, and we got enough strawberries this winter for our own lab. But, urban production in a very intense... So most of our tomatoes and cucumbers come from Toronto, where they do this greenhouse production just outside the city, and then we get the rest of it from Amsterdam and Holland. So bringing these... production inside to where we have the demand is a big solution, and so you can use this to filter water and waste, just like the biosphere. We heard about, this biosphere was only 98% sustainable, that it was a failed experiment because they couldn't, live perfectly in an airtight condition, but they lived pretty comfortably. Well, they lived pretty well for the amount of land that they had. And so there's a lot of these different ideas. We need to get off of coal and get on to wind and solar, and get out of our cars and out of our planes, out of lines and into bikes and trains and buses, and food, from fast food commodity production to local organic agriculture for our kids. Cities need to be built with this in mind, so that waste goes back into food, closing the loops of the cities, mimicking natural ecosystems. These are some designs for sustainable cities in China, and here's a design from Martin Felsen Urban Labs for Chicago. Growing water, green boulevards, eco boulevards that reverse the flow of the river to recharge our water asset in the lake. And here's our park systems. So every 800 or every mile, you put in one of these green boulevards for pedestrians and bikes and ecosystem services. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to your questions.